So after going over a bunch of different iterations of a pulverized Druid build, which is still the strongest Druid build for Season 9, I wanted to start to go over other Druid builds to give you different options for different play styles. And while these builds won't be as strong as that pulverized Druid build, these builds will still allow you to do basically all content in the game. The only thing you won't be able to do with most of the future builds I'm going over for Season 9 is you won't be able to push as high in the pit as that pulverized Druid build, but you'll still be able to do everything else in Torment 4. And this build is going to be a stormclaw Druid build, which is a basic skill build. Now this build is using quite a lot of uniques, but it is only using one mythic, which is the Shroud of False Death, primarily because you get the +1 to all passives. Just that stat on any item in the game would make that item worth or the best in slot item for that slot. But another really good part about this item, besides a max life, is the +2 all stats, which will allow you to get the secondary effect or the secondary bonus of all of the rare nodes throughout your Paragon board. But then for our other uniques, we're using Tempest Roar. This is primarily so your storm skills are now also werewolf skills, which will allow us to scale some of our skills in additional ways. We have Pain Gorger's Gauntlets, which I think this is kind of bugged right now, so it's primarily used for a lot of the stats on this item. And even if this special effect wasn't on this item, you would still use these gloves just because of how crazy the stats are on it. Then we have Wild Heart Hunger, which just gives us a really big damage bonus from its special effect, which essentially just buffs up our capstone passive from our skill tree, making it significantly stronger. Then we have our weapon, which is Great Staff of the Crone, and I got a 4 greater affix roll, which is one of the handful of 4 greater affix items I've gotten throughout the entirety of Diablo 4's history, and that's actually the reason I made this build. And this is the main thing this build is focused around, because Claw is now also a storm skill, and anytime you use Claw, you will also use Storm Strike, and both Claw and Storm Strike have their damage increased. So basically, anytime we cast Claw, we cast a Storm Strike, basically doubling up the amount of damage from our basic skills. And that brings us into our basic abilities. Starting off, we have 5 points into Claw. This is going to be the skill you're actually using and spamming. Upgrade 1 increases its attack speed. Upgrade 2, it has a chance to be cast twice. And again, this is the main thing on your bar that you're actually going to be spamming. Then we have 5 points into Storm Strike. Storm Strike also has a chaining effect where it chains to multiple enemies around it. Also gives us some damage reduction after using it. This will be auto cast anytime we use Claw. Upgrade 1, it can immobilize enemies. Upgrade 2, it makes enemies vulnerable. So this will also make everything vulnerable at all times as well. Then we're going down 1 point into Cyclone Armor, primarily for the damage reduction. Upgrade 1 makes enemies vulnerable to get upgrade 2, so this will now pull enemies into us and give us some more damage reduction. So this just helps enemies clump around us anytime we use it. Then we're using Blood Howl, just a big heal, reduces the cooldown on kill or when hitting a boss, so we can use this constantly to also proc some of our passives. And then upgrade 2, it generates Spirit, but we get a damage increase after we use it until we shapeshift out of werewolf form, which will be in basically 100% of the time. Then we're going down to Hurricane, which is just damage around us over time. Upgrade 1 slows enemies, upgrade 2 makes enemies deal less damage. This will also proc our unique gloves to help spread some damage around. Then finally, we're going down for our ultimate, which is Grizzly Rage. This will just be buffing up pretty much everything, and the duration is extended basically on kills, but we will have enough cooldown reduction to basically have this up 100% of the time. And 5 points into this also gives us 30% increased armor while it's active, which will allow us to get our armor more easily as well. Upgrade 1, we're always unstoppable in this, so we're unstoppable at all times. Upgrade 2, we fortify a bunch of our max life per second while we're in this, so we're basically always unstoppable, massively buffed up at all times, and we constantly fortify all of the time. Then that brings us into our passives. 3 into Heart of the Wild, because Max Spirit actually increases our damage from one of our aspects. 3 into Predatory Instinct for increased critical strike chance, because we're using basic skills, so pretty much everything's always going to be close to us, or at least the things we're primarily focusing on. Then we have Backlash. After we use a defensive, we gain increased damage. This is where Blood Howl will come in from hitting bosses and killing things, so we can constantly get that proc. 3 into Ancestral Fortitude for increased resistances. Once you're higher level, skill with higher Paragon, you can remove points out of this when you have resistances through other means. Then a vigilance damage reduction after using a defensive. Then we're going down 3 into Nature's Reach. They'll increase damage to distant enemies, deal more damage if they are CC'd, which will be most of the time. And because of our Storm Strike bouncing to additional enemies, this will be buffing that up primarily. 3 into Feral Aptitude, we deal increased damage while healthy, and while above 100% movement speed, the stack, so just massive damage increases. Then we have 1 into Neurotoxins, so enemies are slowed when poisoned. 3 into Envenom, so we deal increased critical strike damage to poison enemies. 3 into Toxic Claws, so we just deal increased poison damage. This is doubled when in werewolf form as well, so even more scaling with this build specifically. Then 3 into Defiance, nature skills do increased damage to elites. 3 into Resonance, so our nature skills do increased damage. Then 3 into Quick Shift, so shapeshifting into a new animal form gives us increased damage. This stacks up. And then Heightened Senses, when shapeshifting into Werebear, gain damage reduction, and Werewolf gain movement speed. Now we will be stacking up these skills by using some of our basic skills. Now we will be stacking these up by alternating between our Claw and Maul. You're going to have a Maul on your bar because you're basically just going to Claw, Maul, and do that until all of your passives are stacked up. I think you have to do it like 5 or 6 times, and that will go super quickly. And then when those are stacked up, you go into Grizzly Rage, which will lock in those passive buffs. And then because we have such low cooldown on Grizzly Rage, we just constantly recast Grizzly Rage while we're in it. So we'll be in Grizzly Rage 100% of the time, meaning all of those passives will be locked in at all times. Then for our capstone, we have Bestial Rage. When shapeshifting, Werebear grants us increased damage, Werewolf gives us increased attack speed. This is another one of those buffs that will be locked in when we go into Grizzly Rage, and this will be buffed up from our unique boots. And then that brings us to our Paragon boards. Like always, there'll be a build planner in the description if you want to follow point by point. These boards are pretty good. I might be changing them up a bit. There may be some more optimal boards, but these ones are pretty good in general. The first board I'm using Earth and Sky, a bonus to magic nodes, and a nature skills do increase damage to crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. The legendary is increased nature magic skill damage. Then the first board we're taking is a Heightened Malice. While a poison enemy is near you, deal increased damage. This stacks up for more poisoned enemies. The glyph we're taking is Spirit, so increase critical strike damage. The secondary is critical strikes increase the damage enemies take from you, stacking up. The legendary bonus is increased critical strike damage. Then we're going over to the left. We're taking Sinister Tendrils, which nature skills deal increased damage against poison enemies, so just a big damage increase, and then a lucky hit to apply an additional poison over time. And the glyph we're taking is Keeper, a bonus to rare nodes within range, which will just give us a bunch of damage increases. The secondary, you and your companions deal increase non-physical damage, and then the legendary is increased non-physical damage as well. And we're going all the way over to the right. We're taking the Thunderstruck board. Storm skills deal increased damage equal to 20% of your damage versus close and distant, up to 60%. This is pretty easy to get it stacked up through a lot of the rare and magic nodes on your board. Then the glyph we're taking is Fanged Claw, another bonus to magic nodes within range, and the secondary is while in Werewolf or Werebear, close enemies take increased damage from you. The legendary is increased damage while shapeshift, and the final board we're taking is Lust for Carnage. We don't care about the spirit, but our werewolf skills deal increased damage. Then the glyph we're taking is Headhunter, which gives a bonus to normal nodes within range and increased damage to elite for the secondary and just increased damage for the legendary. Then that brings us to our spirit boons. We're using Gift of the Stag because, again, increases to our max spirit actually increases our damage based upon one of our legendary aspects. Then Avian Wraith for increased critical strike damage. Iron Feather for increased max life. You can also go the increased attack speed, but I think Iron Feather is generally just better. Then we have Calamity to extend the duration of our ultimate. And then we have Masochistic, which is a lucky hit. Critical strikes with shapeshifting skills have up to a 75% chance to heal you for 10% of your max life. We attack so quickly that this will just give us healing constantly. And then for our mercenaries, we're using Rahir as our actual mercenary primarily because we can get 15% to all resist from one of these passives because we don't have any increase to all resist on any of our gear. So we're going to take that. Then you're taking Bastion with Inspiration. So enemies affected by his Ground Slam take increased damage. Enemies affected by his Bastion take even more increased damage. So this is actually just a big damage buff anytime he casts that. Then for our reinforcement, we're using Aldkin. and we're using Field of Languish. So the primary reason we're using this, anytime we cast it, enemies deal less damage to us, and you can just put it on your basic skill or when you cast any skill in combat. You could also change this out to go with, say, Variana for Bloodthirst for increased attack speed, or pretty much anything else you want. This isn't going to be a really big difference, but I would say for your mercenary, you want Rahir for that increased tier resistances. Then that brings us to our seasonal power. We're going to be using Disintegrate just because it has a low cooldown. Basically, anytime you use a skill and proc this, it just spawns this area on the ground that casts a beam to you. Anything in that beam takes a bunch of damage over time and are slowed, but it's a low cooldown, so it constantly procs a lot, and you can position this beam for some of our other effects. We're using Corrosive Vapor, so anytime it deals damage, it poisons enemies. It'll also disable vampiric effects, which will be helpful for any elites with that. Then we're using Fractured Core if you're doing pit runs, where damage from our catalyst removes the resistance aura effect from those enemies for 8 seconds. You do take increased damage, but this build is really tanky in general. And if you're doing higher tier pit runs, you don't have to worry about killing those purple glowing enemies because this just deactivates them. Then Bloody Charm, damage from your catalyst will execute any non-boss enemies 20% or less health, which is just super helpful, especially in pit runs. And you can position Disintegrate very easily to execute enemies. And with Disintegrate, this is doubled for non-elite enemies, so any non-elites you can execute much more quickly. Then Bottled Wind, invoking your catalyst grants a barrier equal to 50% of your max life for 4 seconds. So we'll just constantly be having barriers because we can constantly proc Disintegrate every 5 seconds. And then that brings us into our gear, starting with our gems and starting with our runes. We're using Igni Gar, so stores offering every 0.3 seconds, cast a non-basic skill to get that offering, and that will give us increased critical strike chance up to 25% to make sure we have really high critical strike chance. Then we're using cast 5 skills, then become exhausted for 3 seconds, and that gives us enough offering to invoke our Druid's Earthen Bulwark for 3 seconds, granting ourselves barrier, which is based off of our max life, so just a really defensive skill, and this will just constantly be proccing pretty much every 3 seconds. Then in your final 2 armor pieces, you just want increased willpower because that is multiplicative damage for your skills. Then for our jewels, for our jewelry, we're using your catalytic skill, deals 33% weapon damage of your infusion element over 3 seconds, and a lucky hit dealing damage of your infusion's element has a 33% chance to trigger its secondary effect. Then we're using you deal increased elemental damage, but take more elemental damage. Then finally, you gain increased primary core stat, max life, and are unhindered. And also the jeweled guardians that can spawn from this, which just spawns 3 elites, will actually count as normal elites in the pit, so that can actually be helpful. And we already went over our uniques and what they do, so going into our aspects, first on our necklace, we have basic skills generate additional primary resource, which doesn't really matter, but the part we care about is basic skills deal increased damage for each point of primary resource you have. And this is why we get primary resource increases from different parts of our build, because this will just give us really massive damage increases. Then we're using the duration of Grisly Rage is increased by up to 10 seconds. In addition, when you crit while in Grisly Rage, it increases your critical strike damage, stacking up to 100%, so just a big damage increase. Then while Grisly Rage is active, your direct damage is converted into poison damage. You deal increased poison damage and you passively spread rabies. And this will also allow both of our basic skills, which cast when we cast 1, to be the same damage type, which allows us to just scale our damage better. Then for our final legendary aspect, which is on our legs, Grisly Rage is now a werewolf skill and shapeshift you into a dire werewolf. Dire werewolves gain increased movement speed and spirit cost reduction. In addition, kills give you more max life, so just healing, but we need this so we can actually use all of our werewolf skills while in Grisly Rage. And there really isn't a ton of super important stats for this build. The primary thing you're going to be wanting is really good passive rolls on your necklace. So Toxic Claws and Venom are the best. And then on your jewelry, you basically want just like crit and attack speed. Those are the main things you want, because all of the other important rolls for other builds are all uniques in this build. But that's the entirety of this Stormclaw Druid build for Season 9. This build is really fun if you like basic skill builds, and it's very easy to play because you're unhindered, you're unstoppable at all times, you're pretty tanky, you have a lot of healing, you're like max movement speed at all times, and anything in Torment 4 is very easy with this build. Any of the bosses in Torment 4 get destroyed. The only thing that is really difficult for this build is going, say, above Pit 90 runs, which there's only really a handful of builds in the game game right now that can do above 90 with any amount of ease. So you'll still be able to be farming like 90 plus pit tiers, and everything else in Torment 4 is very easy and the build just very easy to play. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.